So today we're going to be talking about my nemesis, Margaret Atwood. So firstly, I'm not telling anybody who and who they cannot read, okay? I think there's been larger discussions that we've seen for quite a while now about the nuances of reading problematic authors. Since I've rejoined BookTube, I have noticed that there is a lot of people, like larger booktubers in particular, who still talk about Margaret Atwood's work as if there isn't anything to consider, as if there isn't a caveat and a potential limit that people might have with her work. So what I'm hoping to do in this video is revisit and expand on a previous video I did called UBC Accountable, which detailed the kind of last moment of her engaging in like pretty harmful behavior, but then also discussing a little bit more about Canadian nationalism and the canon of Canadian literature, how those relate, and her place in that, as well as discussing some alternatives to her writing. I know a lot of people may be like, why are we talking about this? Sorry, you mean to tell me a white woman in her 70s is out of touch? And maybe you should be a bit irrelevant? And I see your point, but I raise you Jane Fonda. You know what I'm saying? It can be done, and I think white women need to be held accountable for their actions, the things they do and say, especially when we're talking about someone like Atwood, who still has a lot of influence and power and is still releasing books and whose name is being used to sell other people's books. To begin our journey, we're gonna go back to the year 1972, okay? To discuss how Atwood has always and forever will be a white feminist. This is the year she came out with two books, one of which was called Survival, a thematic guide to Canadian literature. The other was a novel called Surfacing. Survival was an adaptation of her graduate work, and in it she argued that survival as a theme is what distinguished Canadian literature from American and British literature. She situates a reading of her version of the canon of Canadian literature within a lens of victimization. There are two colonial moments going on here. The first one, in terms of talking about survival in a settler colonial context, especially when we're talking about like what is now North America, like the idea of like survival and the frontier and settling the West, okay? Hello? The second moment of colonialism happening here is that even for the time, the works that she chose to look at in terms of her understanding of the canon were so narrow. It was literally just white settler Canadians that were English speaking, and I think there was like two French speaking people. Like that was the diversity happening, you know what I'm saying? And this is during the time where Canada was at the beginning of its whole multicultural moment, okay? And that's a huge part of our national identity. In particular, there was a lot of colonial presumptiveness in discussing who was living on the land and writing stories about it. She almost entirely erases Indigenous people from the history of Canadian literature and argues that it wasn't until only recently that Indigenous writing was being published, and it was always within the context of larger works written by white people. I think it's still relevant to talk about this text, even though it was first written in the 70s. Because it was very popular at the time and still has an impact on the way that Canadians perceive their own literary national canon, okay? Because it is still often defaulted to as like the text on Canadian literature. It's also relevant when discussing the novel Surfacing. So this is a story about a woman's struggle for identity when she returns to her small hometown in Canada to search for her missing father. And on this quest, she is accompanied by her boyfriend as well as another married couple. Through this journey, we see the past eventually overtake her and drive her into the wilderness. The larger context in which this book was written is coming off of the decolonial movement that started in the 1960s, post-World War II, obviously. Some people in their analysis and reading of this book have, in my opinion, misplaced it within a post-colonial literary tradition, or some people have argued that it is both a colonial and a post-colonial text, given Canada's position as both a settler colony as well as a colony of England at the time, and still kind of, you know what I'm saying, Commonwealth. The, in my opinion, misguided reading of this as a post-colonial text comes through in particularly when we talk about gender. This novel is seen as being a feminist text, okay? A white feminist text, because it does discuss and criticize the like social and sexual roles that women occupied in Canadian society at the time. It also had a very kind of frank discussion about abortion at a time when Canada was still very much grappling with this issue and wouldn't really deal with it for another decade or so. There seems to be an appropriation of the post-colonial feminist idea of double colonization. So in a larger like post-colonial feminist text, the idea of double colonization was used to discuss the ways that women in particular were affected by colonization. So not only were women in colonial countries were and continue to be affected by colonialism and white supremacy at large, they're also affected very specifically by white patriarchy. Some people have kind of ascribed, read into, or maybe just pulled out more explicitly the idea that there seems to be an insinuation that white women in this text are colonized by patriarchy. Why patriarchy? Which, that's not how that works. Second moment of colonization comes from the fact that I don't think a lot of people realize, which is how much Margaret Atwood fucking hates America. Like, it's a lot. And in a white Canadian, that trait should be a red flag, because so much of Canadian nationalism is centered around the idea that we are not as bad as America. And this is incredibly dangerous, we could say, because Canada has and continues to have the exact same settler colonial white supremacist institutions that are in the United States. Slavery existed as an institution in Canada. We also had segregation. Settler colonialism in Canada is absolutely thriving. When we're talking about pipelines and land use, we're talking about murdered and missing Indigenous women, we're talking about the obscene amount of water advisories on reserves, like it goes on and on and on. This is so hard to discuss in Canada because the PR team for settler colonialism in Canada did a fantastic job, because we were so entrenched in this idea of Canada as a peacekeeper that it is almost harder to deal with the issues of extreme racism that we have in the country. It's also not even that hidden. We have people like Doug Ford, we have people like Jason Kenney, okay? Like, it's not like we're all hiding under a liberal facade. So given that, Atwood has the absolute audacity in this novel to argue that post-war American exertion of cultural influence or cultural infiltration of Canada is a form of colonialism, and thus positions white settler Canadians as the real victims of US imperialism, completely appropriating and erasing Indigenous peoples in settler colonial Canada. Now we're gonna fast forward all the way to 2016, 2017 and talk about UBC Accountable. I'm only going to talk about it briefly because I did do a whole video that goes into much more detail about it. In short, in 2016, Stephen Galloway, who was a well-known, well-regarded Canadian author, who's also a tenured professor and the chair of the creative writing department at the University of British Columbia, was fired after an investigation that came about through several allegations ranging from 2012 to 2016 of various forms of misconduct that ranged from bullying to physical assault to sexual assault and harassment from both students and colleagues. Joseph Boyden, him and Atwood spearheaded this letter, which is referred to as UBC Accountable, that stated that the process that the university underwent damaged his reputation and his health so severely that it denied him his right to due process. Those who were critical of the UBC Accountable Letter pointed out that there is absolutely a way to condemn the university process, but in a way that also has room for solidarity with survivors and all the complainants who came forward. Instead, Atwood chose to viciously defend an approach that threw the weight of institutional power in terms of all the very influential people who signed that letter against the survivors and those who risked a lot to come forward in a process that they were in no way protected in. Atwood handled the criticism of this letter on Twitter terribly. She was being called into account by a lot of people, particularly Indigenous women and other women of color, and responded to this with the use of very inappropriate and dehistoricized examples, and then defended the use of this hyperbolic characterization of the situation in an op-ed she published at the beginning of 2017 called "Am I a Bad Feminist?" She defended her use of characterizing the situation as being exactly the same as the Salem witch trials, and then offered up a list of other historical events that she felt were comparable with Stephen Galloway being fired from a university position because of allegations of sexual assault. So let's dig into them. Stalin's purges in the USSR, the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, and the beginning of the Iranian Revolution. So there's that. She also stated that anyone who disagreed with the letter, the UBC Accountable Letter, were extremists, and that anybody who believed the survivors were childish and prone to groupthink. In discussing the rest of the op-ed and its connection to The Handmaid's Tale, I'm going to be particularly referencing a piece written by Clarkeisha Kent for The Root, which will be linked down below, as well as all the other things that I have referenced for this video, because she does a really great job of explaining Atwood's investment in rape culture as a white feminist. So in terms of using bad feminist in the title for this piece, Atwood is very much co-opting Black feminist theory, which has been, as Clarkeisha points out, a hallmark of Indigenous feminism since forever. Okay, obviously I meant white feminism. And it did not go unnoticed by Roxane Gay. In this piece, Clarkeisha Kent discusses how The Handmaid's Tale is fundamentally a white feminist text. And this was something that I think was more like widely critiqued when the show came out, but it's still relevant to this discussion. Because in terms of grappling with the idea of white women being stripped of their modern rights, Atwood steals and reappropriates the historical injustices done to Black women under slavery. She then connects this with the way that white women often align themselves with white patriarchy, because the goal of white feminism is always to rid white women of the oppression of white patriarchy, but to not completely abolish it, because then that would destabilize white supremacy and all of the privileges that we get from that. This again was all also happening at the time of Me Too, and we saw a lot of white women like Atwood running to the defense of men, white men, who were accused of sexual assault, and defending men that they had aligned themselves with in order to have access to their adjacent power. There were a lot of other things going on in that op-ed, so there's two pieces in particular, including the one from Clarkeisha Kent, that I suggest reading down below. Full disclosure, there is one video up on my channel in terms of discussing one of her books, which was the Penelope ad. It's the only book I've ever discussed from her, and I kept it up, one, because I updated it with proper context for, you know, how we feel about Atwood now, but also because I felt like that book also revealed the limits of her white feminism, even because I felt like the relationship between Penelope and Helen was really lazily written, and I felt like it was indicative of her limits in terms of writing a feminist text. So now we're going to talk about some alternatives to her writing. All of these authors are living in what is now called Canada. They're all Black, Indigenous, people of color, and about half of them are also queer. In terms of a dystopian with commentary moment, I have two recommendations. The first one is The Marrow Thieves by Sherry Dimeline, which is set in a world that is almost destroyed by climate change. where Indigenous peoples are being hunted and harvested for their bone marrow because it holds the key to the ability to dream, which the rest of the population has lost. The second one is The Tiger Flu by Larissa Lai, which is about a community of parthenogenic women who are exiled by this patriarchal and corporate city-state. So they have to go to war against disease and technology and an economic system that threatens them with extinction. It is V-queer, okay, it's hella gay, and it does include a pandemic, the tiger flu, so if that's a little bit much for you right now, I do suggest her other two books because they are of the same ilk. If you're interested in historical fiction, I recommend looking into the work of Essie Adujian, and I've recently done a video talking about everything that she's published so far, as well as Lawrence Hill, who I've also previously discussed. And if you're looking for like a literary criticism moment, although this is not directly related as an alternative, I would still recommend the work of Billy Ray Belcourt because a lot of his work is very theoretical. It is talking about literature, the canon, nationalism, settler colonialism, and just is, you know, one of my favorite writers, and it's just so good. So I definitely recommend. Thank you so much for joining me through this journey through the white feminism of Margaret Atwood and the dangers of Canadian nationalism. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye!